In the early 1800s, Nantucket was more than a dot on the map. It was the engine of America's whaling industry. Whale oil lit the homes of New York and Boston. It greased factory wheels, powered street lamps, and filled the coffers of ship owners. But the men who harvested it faced grueling, unforgiving conditions. They weren't just sailors, they were hunters, risking everything to harvest a beast that could shatter boats with its tail. The Essex, a 238-ton whale ship, departed Nantucket in August 1819. She was neither the largest nor the fastest, but she was seasoned. This voyage would take her into the Pacific Ocean for 2 to 3 years. There was an unease surrounding the Essex even before she left port. Some called her overdue for a reckoning. She was already over 20 years old, battered by earlier voyages, and had once been blown off course for weeks during a storm in the Atlantic. Before the 1819 voyage, a sudden squall broke her topgallant mast just days from Nantucket. An omen, some said. A veteran sailor refused to reboard after repairs, muttering that the ship would not come back the same way she left. Still, those aboard dismissed such talk. Men who chase whales for a living don't scare easily. But what no one could know, not Pollard, not Chase, not the green deckhands below, was that they were sailing straight towards their demise. On board were 21 men, including Captain George Pollard, only 29 and commanding his first ship. First mate Owen Chase, just a few years older, was driven and precise, with a reputation for discipline. There was also young Owen Coffin, Pollard's cousin, just 17. He had never been to sea. Many aboard hadn't. Their world was cramped and loud. Below deck, the men lived among barrels of salted meat, ropes, canvas, and the ever-present reek of oil and sweat. On deck, it was constant labor, scrubbing, repairing sails, coiling line, and scanning the endless ocean for the white spout of a whale. The whaling process was brutal. When a whale was sighted, the men launched small, fragile boats into the sea, armed with harpoons and lances. A struck whale could dive for miles, dragging the boat behind in what was called a Nantucket sleigh ride. Then came the kill, the gutting, and the grisly process of rendering the blubber in giant iron pots. Burns, injuries, and infections were constant risks. It was work for the desperate or the determined. By November 1820, the Essex had made modest progress in the South Pacific, over 1,000 miles west of South America. On November 20th, the crew spotted a large pod of sperm whales. As 3 whaleboats gave chase, a giant bull whale, unusually large, possibly 85 feet, approached the main ship. The whale moved with eerie focus. It struck the Essex bow with a thunderous impact. Then, as stunned sailors watched, it turned and rammed the ship again. The blow was catastrophic. The bow splintered. Water poured in. Chase and Pollard watched in disbelief as the Essex began to founder. With little time, they salvaged what they could: navigational instruments, dried biscuits, casks of water, and whatever supplies weren't submerged. They crammed these into 3 25-foot whaleboats, never meant for long voyages. There was no sailcloth for shade, no weapons, and no means of communication. Just open boats in the vast Pacific. Pollard proposed heading west to the Marquesas, just over 1,000 miles away. But stories of islander cannibalism, exaggerated or not, made the men balk. They chose instead to sail south, then east, hoping to reach the coast of South America. It added hundreds of miles to their journey and weeks of exposure to sun and sea. What followed was a slow collapse of order, health, and hope. The sun baked their skin to leather. Salt water soaked their clothes, opening sores. Drinking water became the obsession. The barrels they had salvaged were few, and some had been tainted by seawater. Their food, mostly hardtack biscuits, became infested with salt and mold. Meals were doled out crumb by crumb. The boats were vulnerable. One was damaged and constantly took on water, requiring a man to bail continuously. At night, temperatures dropped sharply. Sleep was nearly impossible. The men began to drift in and out of delirium. Some saw hallucinations. Some cried out for family. Others simply grew silent. On December 20th, a month after the Essex sank, the men spotted Henderson Island. It seemed like salvation. They hauled ashore and gorged on birds, shellfish, and fresh water from a tiny spring. But the island was too small and barren. It couldn't support them for long. After a week, the decision was made. 17 would head back to sea in search of rescue. 3, too weak or unwilling, remained behind. They were later rescued. The rest rode into deeper despair. Within weeks, one boat was lost entirely, vanishing into stormy seas. No trace of it was ever found. The remaining boats drifted far apart. Men began to die. The survivors faced a terrible choice. They turned to the only source of nourishment left, their dead crewmates. Bodies were stripped, flesh cut into strips and dried in the sun. Organs were eaten first. Bones were cracked for marrow. It was methodical, horrifying, and necessary. One man, Isaac Cole, began to lose his mind. He was restrained, but soon died. On Pollard's boat, no one had yet succumbed. They decided to draw lots. Owen Coffin, the young cousin Pollard had sworn to protect, drew the short straw. He accepted his fate calmly. His friend Charles Ramsdell fired the shot. They ate what they had to. Pollard never forgave himself. Meanwhile, Chase's boat, equally gaunt and skeletal, drifted into the path of a passing ship, the Indian, on January 23rd. Only 3 aboard were still alive. A second ship, the Dauphin, discovered Pollard and Ramsdell 2 weeks later, barely alive, surrounded by human bones. They had been at sea for over 90 days. Of the 21 men who sailed from the Essex, only 8 survived. The 3 left on Henderson Island were later found and rescued. When they returned to Nantucket, the town struggled to process the story. Cannibalism was taboo, but the facts were undeniable. These were not savages. They were neighbors, sons, brothers. The community met their return with a quiet, uncomfortable sympathy. Owen Chase published a detailed account of the voyage, titled Narrative of the Most Extraordinary and Distressing Shipwreck of the Whale Ship Essex. It became a sensation. Melville read it years later and wove its core into Moby Dick. He would later visit Chase's widow and son in Nantucket. Captain Pollard's story was darker. He never sailed again. His second ship wrecked early in its voyage, seen by some as a sign. He returned home in disgrace. He took work as a night watchman and faded from public life. Each year, on the anniversary of Owen Coffin's death, he would fast alone in his room. Chase fared better. He continued to sail, but struggled with nightmares and migraines. In later years, he developed severe paranoia and was eventually confined to his attic, where he hoarded food obsessively. The legacy of the Essex endures because it strips human nature down to its rawest form. Civilization fell away. What remained was instinct, survival, and guilt. The whale was not a monster. It was just defending itself. But the sea was relentless. It devoured ships, erased trails, and pushed men to the edge of humanity. The Essex wasn't just lost to the ocean, it was sacrificed to the cost of ambition, isolation, and the fragility of human order when nature stops playing fair. Today, the Essex is remembered not for how she died, but for what her survivors had to become in order to live.